Hello and welcome to this poetry workshop on podcasting/interviews. My name is Jennifer Mariani and I'd like to begin by thanking Marian Lahid of Off Topic Publishing. I'd also like to thank the League of Canadian Poets and the Canada Council for the Arts. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge that I live, work and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kanawa, Bagani, the Tsuut'ina, the Eithka Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I am originally from Zimbabwe, and I've been in Canada for 18 years now. Last year, my first chapbook, All Forgotten Now, was published by Off Topic Publishing. It's a collection of poems about leaving my homeland and the grief and longing that go with starting a new life somewhere else. At the end of this workshop, I will read a couple of poems from my chapbook. About myself, my day job has been being a ballet teacher all my life, and I came to Canada to teach ballet. I still teach at the Alberta Ballet School in Calgary. During COVID, I decided to return to my writing that had taken a slide since I had children, and that's when I found a wonderful community of writers amongst the Canada Writes and amongst Marian Lahid and the friends at Off Topic Publishing. And so I started submitting some poems and some writing and managed to have some publications, which was very exciting. And then eventually that ended up in me working with Marian to publish All Forgotten Now. And then in terms of promoting the book, I started to get into some literary podcasts. And for me, this was a whole new world, something that I was completely unfamiliar with. I wasn't really a podcast listener, or I never really thought about it. Being on air is not one of my favorite things to do. And I feel like speaking, especially live, is not one of my fortes. So yeah, the world of podcasting was something that was entirely new to me. And so in today's workshop, I'm just going to give sort of an overview of my experience that I've had with podcasting and interviews. And I'm going to talk about how to find podcasts that fit your style and pitching to different podcasts based on their themes, preparing for the podcasts, reading your work aloud, and navigating podcasts gone wrong or some awkward situations. So I hope that you'll enjoy this workshop on podcasting, and at the end I'll leave my email address if you have any questions or you'd like to be in touch with me. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is being a good podcast guest. So using the internet for research, we're lucky in that there's just so much information out there, so many different ways to find podcasts. Personally, I would say I barely scratch the surface when I use things like Spotify. And, I started searching literary podcasts. It was something I enjoyed listening to while I was cycling in the basement. And I could hear from other writers. I could hear about books that perhaps I didn't know about. And I would say the internet is a good place to start doing some of your research. You can locate lots of literary podcasts. I also discovered through my editor that there are Facebook groups, huge Facebook groups for people who are podcast hosts, who are looking for guests, and for people who are looking to be guests on podcasts. And often they're very neatly hashtagged by subject, and it's a great way to be able to sort of expand your circle and look for podcasts and find out what's out there. In terms of researching your podcast, I would say think about, is this podcast going to be worth my time? Is it going to help to promote my writing? And I would say that in order to do that, you're going to need to listen to at least 2 episodes of the podcast that you're thinking of to try and get a feeling for the rhythm of the show. Personally, once I found literary podcasts, I enjoyed listening to them. And I noticed that they tend to take on a pattern. So, once you've listened to a couple of episodes, you might be able to note any parts or segments that are consistent between episodes. Does the host or hosts open or close with the same questions so that you're prepared to participate in those? and you know what's coming. One podcast that I was on, one of my favorite podcasts, they had a segment where both hosts and the guest put forth their favorite book or which book they were reading that week. And that seems to be a common question. So I always suggest, having a recommendation, a book recommendation on hand, your title, your author, and a brief synopsis of, the book, and you can tell why that's a great book to read. Another way to sort of suss out your podcasts is to see, are there any reviews of the podcast online? See what the listeners have to say about the podcast. Maybe you can find out any other guests who've had experience on that podcast, what they have to say about that. In my experience, word of mouth and referrals from other writers are an excellent way to secure a good quality podcast, and also a way to weed out some of the ones that aren't worth your time. You can learn from others' mistakes and save your time and energy with the ones that might not work out. I always suggest ask your writers circle or your Facebook group of writers if they have any recommendations of podcasts they enjoy listening to, if they've personally been on any podcasts, what their experience is like, and if they're willing to pass your name along. It's a great way just to sort of expand your circle there. In terms of your podcast, once you've decided by listening to a few episodes, this is a great podcast for me to go on, I would say get to know your host. So primarily in my experience, emails have gone backwards and forwards between myself and the host. We've got to nail down a date and a time that works, often sorting through time zones. I've had podcasts that have been from a European host, so we've sorted out how to navigate the booking of dates and times that will work. And the emails go backwards and forwards. I would say research your host and get to know them. Do your hosts maintain a social media presence for the podcast? And if so, what are they posting about? What are their interests? What sort of seem to be the stream that they're on with their podcast. Learn why they do their podcast and what they enjoy about it. I would say in your preliminary emails, that's the time to ask your podcast host or your interviewer the questions that you have. So for myself, being new to podcasting and interviews, I like to be well prepared because speaking is not my forte. So I usually have what I would say now is a good format of questions that I like to ask so that I know how I can be best prepared for the interview. And I found a lot of the hosts are great. They already have a pre-interview questionnaire or survey so that they can get to know you. And often when I've said to the hosts, do you have an idea of what questions you're going to ask so I can be prepared? Some hosts have actually sent me lists of questions. So I've been able to read through them in my own time. I've been able to clarify with the host. I've been able to type out my answers. I find that particularly helpful, and just be really well prepared. And so I think learning about your host, learning about why they have their podcast, asking them questions before you start is really helpful just to iron out any kinks along the way. I also think, they're trying to learn about you before they have you on your show. And I think it helps for a greater rapport on the show when there's just a little bit of background information on both parts. And if they send you a interview questionnaire or survey, that's a great time to fill it out in as much detail as you can, because your host will have things like your biography, and probably you'll have sent them samples of your work or a copy of your work, but it's a great time for them to get to know the story of you, your background, why you write, and it allows them to sort of pick up the threads of where they're going to take the podcast. So I strongly recommend putting in as much information as you can there, and they will weed it out. And you've asked your own questions of them. Often I found the actual meeting of the hosts of podcasts is on the day of the podcast. Usually there's 15 minutes before the episode starts recording. I think maybe in one or two instances, a host had asked for a meeting a week before so that we could just have a meet and greet, we could see each other and ask some questions that way. If that's an option or an opportunity, it's also a good way to kind of get to know your host and see their setup, ask questions that maybe haven't been answered in your emails. Because in general, most hosts sort of pop online 15 minutes before you get going. My suggestion is to get all your questions done before, because in those few minutes before you go online and you start recording, you don't really have time to get into a lot of things. My other point about picking your podcast, getting to know your host, is also get to know the audience. So who's the target audience for this particular podcast? And if you know why somebody's listening to this podcast, it might help you to be a better guest on the podcast. You can sort of tailor your answers to meet the audience and to apply more to that audience in particular. So, with a lot of literary podcasts, they can be broad ranging in category. Myself, I enjoy listening to literary podcasts, but I mostly write poetry. In fact, that's pretty much all I write. So the podcasts I've been on have been, that little niche of poetry, or the interview has been for a poetry segment. And so I would say in those instances, I haven't had to worry too much about, tailoring to my audience. Sometimes when I have been asked to do other podcasts that are related to my life or my other work, then it's sort of, I can tailor in that theme. So I've done podcasts about being an immigrant, podcasts about Africa or traveling. I've done podcasts that are related to trauma. I write about eating disorders. I write about domestic violence. And so sometimes I'm appearing on podcasts that may not necessarily be fixed on writing, on poetry, or necessarily on my book, but there is an audience to reach out there. So I know at first when I looked at podcasting, I thought, well, I have to find a podcast that's about poetry every time. And then I found that that wasn't necessarily true, that there are other people who will be happy to read your work. And, if you're writing nonfiction, if you're writing books, I think you have an even bigger opportunity there to look at podcasts that might not necessarily be your genre, but they might have a broader audience. The hosts in general are going to ask about your life and your background at the start of the show. There's your time to tell your audience a little bit about yourself. I always think you want to begin well, have some relevant stories or anecdotes on hand so that you can tell your biography in an interesting way. In this day and age, you might want to start with a land acknowledgement depending on where you are. I also like to recommend a trigger warning depending on the content of your work if it requires it. Personally, I write about racism, I write about eating disorders, I write about domestic violence, and I feel like all those topics need to be mentioned at the start. It's just a courtesy to other people. And one tip that I was given was have a good origin story, 1 to 2 minutes of who you are, how you got to where you are with your writing, and some interesting highlights along the way where you can leave signposts, as I like to call them, for your host to come back to. Remember, it's your host's or interviewer's job to dive deeper later on and to decide which of the highlights you've mentioned or the signposts you've left to talk about to guide the conversation. So there are standard questions in a lot of these podcasts, and you can think of interesting ways to answer them. I've done a few interviews where I've had to answer on the fly whatever's come up, and it's a little bit nerve-wracking for me. But generally, if you've got a host who's got some good rapport, they'll put you at ease, they'll make great conversation, and then it feels more just like a conversation between two people rather than, being interviewed, being put on the spot there. I think a lot of questions that I found recurring were things like, why do you write? What is it that compels you to write? And obviously everyone has their own reasons for writing. And I've been asked questions like, who's my favorite poet and why? That one's always an easy one for me to answer because it's always Pablo Neruda and it's never changed. So these are some of the sort of things that I would say fall under the list of standard questions. Often your audience wants to know why you're writing, how you got to your writing, how you progressed along your writing journey to become published, or sort of how you learned along the way. And your job when you're a guest on a podcast is to establish your credibility, your experience and your successes, and establish some rapport, your personal story, perhaps some of your failures. And I'm always happy to share some of my things that have gone sideways, especially on podcasts. And I always, suggest leaving some highlights of some parts of your life that are interesting. Your host may come back to them later on if they have time towards the end of the podcast. They might want to pick up a couple of things that are, outside of the writing that would be interesting to the audience. If you're like me, I suffer from nerves when I am speaking. It is not my favorite thing to do, and especially if I'm speaking live on air on a podcast. So for me, it helps to have a familiar script to follow. And even today, I have typed copious notes for my workshop. It helps to keep me on track, helps me to stop going down some rabbit holes. And so because most of your hosts will be obliging to send you questions beforehand, having a script on hand might be helpful for you if you're like me and you struggle to just speak off the cuff. I noticed even now when I'm doing my podcasts or interviews, I say a lot. So speaking is not one of my strengths, and I've really had to work at being able to continue the conversation. I often go down rabbit trails when I'm answering questions or when I'm following a thought. So I find that a script or some notes help me to eradicate that need to talk a lot and to fill the silence or the sort of dead air. And it's taken me a while to learn that it is the host's job to lead the conversation. I always say before, let me know how much or how little you want me to speak. And they say, answer the question. And if they want more, they'll ask for more. So in my experience, less is more when answering the questions. I've had a few unfortunate experiences along those lines where the hosts have maybe been less experienced or not as confident in the job that they're doing as a podcast host. And there has been silence or dead air, and they have not carried on the interview or the conversation. And those have been particularly difficult. And I think some of that awkwardness is just learning good podcasts from bad podcasts and hosts who have the gift of the gab and that online presence that manages to carry a show or a podcast along. I've had some really great experiences where it's been so easy to speak to the host or the interviewer because they really know what they're doing. They really know where they're leading you, and they've done their work before the podcast in getting to know you and getting to know your work. And so it's been very easy. And I think some of those podcasts that perhaps didn't turn out so well are more of a learning experience. And you can kind of get a sense when you're emailing backwards and forwards, or if you're able to have a meet and greet before, kind of how it's going to go. And I have learned that it is not my job to fill the silence during the interviews. I'm there to answer the questions and let the host carry the rest of it, whether they're able to or not. I did mention earlier pre-interview or survey questions, and this is a great time for you to really go into detail here, and it gives your host a lot of information to get to know you more. They will have asked for your bio and possibly some excerpts of your work, or in my instance, I send them digital copy of my chapbook before so that they have the opportunity to read it. The most successful podcasts I've been on have been because the hosts have not just kind of got a rough idea of who I am and what my brief bio is. They've really read my work, and they've got to know me through my writing, and they've asked interesting in-depth questions about certain parts of my work, specific poems. And then I've been really pleasantly surprised by the hosts who have included quotes or lines from their favorite poems in the book, or they've highlighted a poem and said, I've read your body of work and this is my favorite poem and this is why I really enjoy it. And they've asked in-depth questions about that poem in particular, why I wrote it, how I wrote it. And they've sort of really taken the time to get to know not just what I call the bio, the brief story. They've really got to dive into the writing, and then they're pulling it apart and just really giving in-depth questions for you to answer, which is, I would say, my most successful podcasts and interviews that I've been on. In terms of questions that you can continue to ask your host before you begin, for those of you who are maybe not tech savvy, I personally am not tech savvy, in case you didn't notice yet. It's always helpful to ask your host what platform they're using. Typically, I've found most people these days are using Zoom, but in case they're using a different website or a different platform, it's good to ask the questions, will that require any prep beforehand, like a download or a setup? Because you don't want to be sitting at your laptop ready to log into your interview. You know you've got about 10 minutes, and then you click the link they've sent you, and if you're like me, you realize, oh, this requires, you know, some technology I don't have, some software I don't have, and then it's a bit of a panic. So questions that I like to ask the podcast host or the interviewer before we begin is, what platform will you be using? What do I need to download? What do I need to set up? And then my favorite questions for them are, is the episode recorded or is the episode live? And then that really is going to change for you, you know, how you prepare for it. Maybe not necessarily how you prepare for it, but if it's recorded, you know that you might have the opportunity, if you mess up, to pause, to take a break, to repeat the question or the answer. I've had some very gracious hosts where, because it's been a pre-recorded session, I've said to them, if I mess up, am I able to stop the reading and start it again? And they've said, absolutely. And then I've had the experience of being on shows where they are recorded one time and you're answering, you're reading, and that's sort of it, and you have to live with it. Personally, I've found the pre-recorded ones, I just feel a little bit more sense of calm because I know I'm not actually speaking to a live audience. I feel a little bit less pressure. And I would say, of all of the interviews and podcasts I've done, the majority of them have been pre-recorded. And depending on the host's capabilities, I would say probably about 3/4 of those, they have been able to cut them and start them again if necessary. They've had the tech savvy that I don't have if they've needed to do any retakes. So those are questions that are good to ask. And then along those lines, the other questions that are good to ask is, are you going to have video or just audio? And so with the ones with video, obviously you need to have a webcam or computer camera of some sort set up. And then if you're like me, I podcast or workshop from my dining room table in my house because there's no dedicated space. I don't have an office. I don't have a writing desk. So in terms of getting yourself set up and prepped, I generally recommend, you know, making sure you've got a space where there's some good lighting and it's sort of a calm background if you can. I've noticed some of the technological advancements we have allow for you to set a background on some of those things like Zoom. And I was gifted a really lovely web camera that I've yet to figure out how it works, but it will actually, with a color card, it will sort out your lighting for you and everything. So depending on how many of them you're going to do and how fancy you want to get, you've got a lot of options there. But you first want to make sure that you've got a clear background, something calm, where you're sitting, the good lighting like I mentioned, and then you'll need to check whether your laptop microphone is good enough or perhaps you need a headset. Personally, I don't have a headset. I work with my laptop camera and my laptop audio. So far, it's not something that I've had any issues with, and generally the host has checked sound levels before we've begun a recording, and that's sort of their job to make sure as well that you are clear and that you can be heard. While I'm on the topic of how you set up for your podcasts with your video and your audio and your space, I will share some of my failures that I've had in not really thinking too much about background noise. So that's another one to have to think about. Perhaps some of you have a room that you can sit in with the door shut and it's quiet and you don't have to worry too much about excessive background noise. I don't have that luxury. So for me, it's usually being able to calendar mark some time in my schedule where nobody else is in my house so that I know nobody will be inadvertently popping into my video to say, hey mom, can I have a snack? Because they like to do that. And I've learned small things along the way that for some of you, I guess it might be common knowledge, but because you know, I'd never done it before, I didn't think about it, and my phone is always set to silent. I didn't realize that I had to set my laptop to silent, because if my phone rings, it will ring on my laptop, or a text message will ding on my laptop. So silencing your phone, silencing your laptop. The one particularly good failure I had was that my dishwasher was running, and I am broadcasting from my dining room table. I have this lovely dishwasher that is exceptionally quiet, and when it's running, you don't actually know that it's on. So I didn't even know that the dishwasher was running at the time. It had completely slipped my mind. And cue towards the end of the interview, I've got to the poetry reading, which to me is sort of the main event of the interview. And the dishwasher started draining, and that was not silent. And it was not one of the interviews where they were going to do retakes. So I have learned from trial and error. You can't have your dishwasher running. And as for my furry friends, I have had a couple of cats make appearances. So generally I have to make arrangements for my kitties to be in a different room from me just for the length of the interview, because they're not known for sitting quietly and not making noise. And so that was just something I wanted to share with you from my experience in getting yourselves set up if you don't have a dedicated, quiet, clean, calm space for podcasting from, or your workshops, your interviews. So yeah, that covers your video, that covers your audio, that covers your space, and then obviously any background noises that you have. I mean, I think everyone understands in this day and age, sometimes it's inevitable that something will happen. The other couple of things to remember: ensure you're comfortable using your host's name or names or pronouns. I have had hosts check in with me before, what's the correct pronunciation of my name? You know, personally, I'm not too fazed if people struggle. And I've had hosts check in with me the pronunciation of the country that I was born in, or the town where I was born, which is very considerate of people. So there's some things you can do just to make sure it runs smoothly. Most of the podcasts, like I've said, they tend to be warm and conversational if you have a great host. And so as in my experience, as I've sort of eased into it and my nerves have come down a bit, then it's easier to be comfortable and to sound like you're having a conversation, as opposed to, you know, just reading your answers that you've scripted word for word. I always mention before time, I think I said this earlier, that I'm happy to elaborate if the hosts want me to be more in-depth in my answers. Keep in mind that the length of a lot of podcasts is actually not that long. Some of them as short as 30 minutes to 45 minutes. 45 minutes I've found to be a sort of general mark. I haven't done too many that are an hour long. So, you know, you keep in mind the length of the podcast when you're answering questions. And the fun of podcasts is definitely the rapport and the conversational feeling, that back and forth. So try not to think of it as a monologue, you just talking your way through it. Give some time for the host to lead the way, and you just follow wherever it is that they're taking. Personally, because I talk a lot, I find that I'm never quite sure where to finish an answer, and I feel the need to keep talking. So with a great host, I think they put you at ease where you don't necessarily need to feel that. And like I've said before, if you touch on some interesting highlights along the way, either in your story of origin, you know, your day job, your hobbies, how you came to writing, any quirky sort of things, you leave some signposts along the way, your host can always go back and find some of those things that were interesting to them or that they know would be interesting to their audience, and ask you to highlight those. In terms of preparing not just your answers, but your work, ask ahead of time, do they want you to read any of your work? I have found that most of the podcasts that are about books or poetry almost always would like a reading or a sample of your work. And so it's good to prepare those ahead of time. And you can ask your hosts, do they have any poems in particular or any segments of your work that have stood out to them that they particularly want you to read? I almost always want the host to pick based on the knowledge that they know their audience better than I do. And in some instances, the host has said, I would like 3 and you pick them. And so then I try to find things that are contrasting, that are maybe not necessarily all the same. Depends again on the target audience, depends on whether we're talking about my chapbook in particular, or, you know, if I'm dealing one of the other themes that I write on, then I'm looking for other work that I can bring and read there. And I know for me that because talking is something I find difficult, I don't actually have a lot of experience of reading my poetry aloud. And so reading work aloud is a new experience for me. And I didn't realize how unconfident I would be in reading the words, in the nuances, in the tone, in how I would like to shade and shape my poetry. I know how it sounds to me when I write it. I know when I look at it on the page what it means. And I would say that for me, and maybe for yourselves too, reading aloud is a completely different experience. So definitely practice. If you have an audience you can practice on, practice. I have the record feature on my laptop, and so I actually just did a few practice runs that way. Recorded myself reading a poem, and then I could play it back, which was kind of one of those sort of cringe moments for me to watch myself on camera reading my work. But it definitely gives you an idea. Am I reading too fast? Have I got the nuances in the work that I want? Is it making it come alive for the audience? And, you know, perhaps in your writer's circle, you have the opportunity to practice reading your work aloud. Perhaps you have someone who will give you feedback, who will say, hey, it's a great poem, not necessarily a great reading, or you're on the right track, but you know, here's some feedback. And I definitely recommend that if you can get some, because I know for me, I sort of felt out on a limb, like I was just kind of doing things blind a little bit and hoping for the best. And so knowing which work you're going to read, preparing that work to be read. Sometimes you get to it, sometimes you don't get to it. Maybe they ask for 3 poems, you only get to 1. In my experience, I've had the hosts wait until the end of the interview or the podcast and then ask for the 3 poems in a row. And they've asked, can you give us a little bit of background on each poem? So make sure you've prepared your background on your work. In some of the podcast format, they've asked questions about a particular poem. They've asked, again, why I wrote it, how it was relevant. And then they've said, could you read us that poem or a section from that poem? And then as the questions have moved on, we've discussed a different poem. And then they've asked for the reading of that poem at that time. So they've sort of been interspersed amongst the interview too. I have had a couple of interesting moments where I had work prepared that I, excuse me, felt confident to read online. And then as it turned out, the conversation referenced some of the other work. And then the host said, well, why don't you read that one? And I realized, excuse me, how unprepared I was to read some of the other work, because I hadn't practiced it, I hadn't prepared it, I hadn't read it aloud, and in my naivety I hadn't even thought, oh, maybe they will put me on the spot and ask me for something else. And so one of my little notes is read lots of your work aloud to yourself, on your camera, to somebody else, so that you have the practice of doing that. I will say in retrospect, I stumbled through a few of those poems, messed up a few of the words here and there, wasn't really happy overall with how they came out. And so that was definitely a big learning curve for me. I felt confident in prepared work, and then on the spot, I felt like I didn't quite make it as well as I could have. So yes, preparing your work, checking with your host what they want you to read. If they give you the ability to pick your own pieces, by all means try to find things that stand out from your work that maybe are contrasting to each other, and always a little bit of a background to that piece of work you're reading, what it's in reference to, or how you wrote it, or why you wrote it, what you were hoping to achieve, just to sort of give it a nice rounding out of that story. I'm just going to clear my throat here. So most of the hosts have asked, when I've sent stuff in, do you have a biography? Do you have an author photo? Do you have social media? So those are easy things to prepare. Make sure you've got a nice headshot of some kind that you can send. The podcasts or interviewers often have social media where they're promoting their podcast, and they will put in your photo, they will put in your biography, and if you have any social media handles or emails the way that you're being contacted, you can ask them, will they be able to promote your book or your author website? And most of them are very happy to. They'll say, send us a picture of the cover of your book, or hold up your book while we're on the interview so that our audience can get a look at it. And they're happy to say, you know, this is Jennifer, we interviewed her about her book, here's a link to where to buy her book. And I have found that, you know, sometimes you can actually have a coupon perhaps, or a giveaway. You could have a discount for the audience of just that podcast. If you're able to do that, if you're able to arrange that, that's a great little incentive there to say, just for the listeners to this podcast, we have a deal for you if you're purchasing this book. And then your host will have links to the podcast once it comes out, or the interview. They're usually promoting it on social media, and every time I've had them send it to me, they tell me what date it's going live, where it's going live, what platforms they're broadcasting on. And so then you also have the chance to promote your work and your through your social media, to ask your circle to promote it through their social media too. In terms of your biography, I often have a few biographies ready to go for podcasts and interviews, depending on who the target audience is. So if I'm talking, you know, about trauma, I have a biography that highlights my life as a dancer, as a ballet teacher, the struggle I had with anorexia and bulimia, recovery, and the poetry that goes along with that. If I'm talking about my chapbook, I have a biography that highlights, you know, my upbringing in Africa, my work related to writing about Africa, and things like that. So sometimes if you have a few biographies by the themes of your work, then they're ready to go when you need to send them off. So that's something else that I recommend if you're looking at blogs that are maybe outside just your genre. Usually the hosts, after they've sent you everything for your episode, make sure that beforehand you've sent them the link, your links to your work, either digital copy so that they can read it. These are things I had to learn or remember. Oh, they might, you know, want a copy of my book to read for themselves, not just my bio and then just ask me questions. So you want to make sure you've got some digital links that you can send them. I think only one person asked for a hard copy of the book, and you know, those kind of things are easily dealt with. And then after your podcast, you know when it will air, you've got your links for it, you can send it on the socials, thank your host for having you, and you know, you can ask your host, can I refer other guests to you? It's really nice for everyone in your circle, the word of mouth. I've referred a couple of people who the host has said, do you know anyone else who'd be interested in coming on the podcast? And so I've been able to give them a few names, and I've been able to ask, do you have any other podcasts or hosts that you know about? So it's a great way to network. It's a great way to expand which audiences are learning about you and your work as well. And then the other thing I was going to say about podcasting, I have found it to be, something that you have to set aside time for, you have to prepare for. If you're like me and talking online is maybe not something that you're really comfortable doing, it was one of those things I sort of had to say to myself, oh, is this really worth it? But in this digital day and age, it's good to remember that, a lot of these things stay online. So if, for instance, you're not selling 100 books after your podcast, which I have never done, by the way, you can remember that at some point people will stumble upon these podcasts. People will at some point find these interviews, these readings of your work online. They're sort of out there and they tend to stay out there, and you're promoting them on social media and other people are promoting them on social media. So, there is that longevity that the work that you've put in, the time that you've taken, as well as, networking and, improving your circle, perhaps you're getting your work out there to different audiences, and you just never know when that's going to result in maybe the sale of a book or other opportunities down the road. So, podcasting is something you really want to think about, doing your research, finding a good podcast, finding a good host, being well prepared for it. And then you also have the opportunity for that interview to stay out there and for other people to stumble upon your work. So I wish you well, should you decide to go ahead with interviews and with podcasts. If you have questions for me, I am happy to answer them. I don't have a writer's website, so my email address is Jenny, Jenne, and my last name, Mariani, Mariani, @yahoo.com. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions in particular that I could answer, I would be happy to do that. And I would like to read to you from my own chapbook, which I've mentioned quite a few times, and I do recommend name dropping your book as often as you can. So here it is. This is my chapbook called All Forgotten Now, published by Off Topic Publishing. And in honor of National Poetry Month, this month, the theme of which is joy, I've just decided to select 2 poems to read to you. And the first poem is called Song of Home. And this poem is important to me because I actually wrote it in 2004, sitting in the Harare International Airport as I came to Canada for what I thought would be a few months. And 18, almost 19 years later, I am still here in Canada. But it was my first poem that I ever had published. And although the tone of the poem is about death, I hope that you find a little spark of joy amongst the words. So here it is. This is Song of Home. Take my ashes to Africa, take them home for me. Fling them joyously across the savannah with upraised hands, as if in praise to the fire blue skies. Toss me into the whispering red gold grass, sprinkle me amongst dusty jasmine on an August afternoon. Lay me beneath the old baobab, standing sentry, sunspun, as I am falling upwards, slowly ascending. Spread me languidly in the shadow of spring-burnished msasa trees, and when jacaranda days are come again, throw me aloft to rest in their bright branches. Sail me down the Zambezi, scatter me along the Savi, in secret places only we have stood. Bury me beneath the Doma hills as the sun sets on my soul, for here with you I am home, I am home. Leave me there for the rest of time, dead as dead can be, but alive again, at long last, free. I'm going to read one more poem for you, and this poem that I'm going to read for you is called Dust and Fire, and it is the last poem in my chapbook, and it kind of rounds out the chapbook. So let me read for you Dust and Fire. I am 39 years wide, grown memory by memory, and heavy with wine and tears. I am the height of my childhood dreams, and my hair the color of the magic my mother bestowed upon me. My cheekbones were carved by Kalahari winds, sharpened my youth and later rounded mounds, fleshed out dunes of sand, soft and shifting. I weigh more than your expectations, made strong by the women who came before me, built for battle and leaving legacies of bodies that are expanding. There will be no skin and bone here, no smallness in our lineage. I am pearls of moonlight strung into a body that moves with abandon, a ballerina hefty with passion stepping into the air. My eyes the flare of the Mediterranean, cathedral domes and stalagmites. My breath is August in Africa, dust and fire and spring returning life to lungs. I am the infinite expanse of my daughters, echoing outwards, stardust suspended in eternities. I spill from my clothes, uncontainable, in ocean, untamable, unbound. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Jennifer Mariani, and I hope you've enjoyed this workshop. Thank you.